Hello, welcome along to episode 232 of Adventures in Pop. My name is Simon Jacobs, as it tends to be. I'm still sitting here, gloating over my gorgeous YouTube plaque of 100,000 subscribers. And so let me just start by saying hello to all my subscribers. And if you haven't subscribed, well, I think you should just have a think about it. I don't want to push too hard. What I do want to talk about in this episode, well, it's two things, but it's really brought about by one thing, and that is the death of Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys earlier this week at the age of 82. And it really got me thinking, partly about just how brilliant he was and how influential he was. But, as I started reading the kind of obituaries and the really heartfelt messages that big superstars around the planet posted about Brian Wilson, it got me thinking about what do we mean when we talk about genius, and it's a really interesting area. I think you'll remember only a few episodes back I was talking about the rather lofty term of inspiration that lots of people talk about when it comes to songwriting or art of any sort. And I was being a little bit just a bit wary of using such a term as inspiration. I'd be even more wary about using a term such as genius, because you don't want to overuse it. If you start describing everybody as a genius, I think you utterly devalue what you mean by genius. So we should just explore that for a moment. And I guess the first question is, does Brian Wilson deserve the moniker of genius? And I would just say straight away, absolutely yes. And if you think about the 60s and the kind of music that was around as the Beach Boys got going, and I would put the Beach Boys next to the Beatles in terms of innovation in those kind of early to mid 60s years, where I think it's well known that Brian Wilson and, in America and the Beatles in Britain, I'm just sort of imagining this scene where a new album would come out from one or other, and the rivals across the pond would sit there and listen to it and think, dear, oh dear, that's really good. We're going to have to come up with something even better. And they did push each other in this kind of creative and, possibly quite revolutionary way of going into areas of pop music where pop music had never been before. And I think, we know that the Beatles did this. It's often talked about. The Beatles, with George Martin, took pop music to places it had never been. Well, I think you can say exactly the same of Brian Wilson. So, we should just have a think about how that came to be from this, troubled young Californian boy. How did he manage to change the shape and sound of pop music? Because frankly, he did. And what I want to do, maybe first of all, is just share some of the things that other people have said, other important people. So I'm talking about Paul McCartney, Elton John and Bob Dylan and Roger Daltrey and all these people who've come out of the woodwork to say, oh my goodness, this man changed everything for me. So let's have a look. I'm looking at a BBC website page here, but it's very instructive. It says, Sir Paul McCartney has paid tribute to legendary Beach Boys frontman Brian Wilson as a legion of stars hailed the singer and songwriter's legacy following his death at the age of 82. And Paul McCartney says, Wilson had that mysterious sense of musical genius, so there's the first ding, genius, that made his song so achingly special. I think that's right. So Elton John, Bob Dylan, and former Beach Boys bandmate Mike Love also described Brian Wilson as a genius. Love said, musical gifts were unmatched and had changed the course of music forever. Yes. Al Jardine, who was a fellow band member, said he was a humble musical giant and his musical intellect was apparent quite early on. And at the same time, he didn't want or need attention, was only interested in making the best possible music. And I think you might know the story, but I think Brian Wilson went on tour with the Beach Boys in their, in their heyday, about 63, 64, found it incredibly difficult and anxiety inducing, and didn't tour with them again for the rest of the decade. And actually it was right into the 90s or 21st century where he eventually went out with them again. And then much later, as as an old man, he did go on tour. But at that time in the 60s, he had that one experience and couldn't do it again. And so in fact he sent the rest of the Beach Boys out on tour, and he stayed back home in the studio, creating new tracks that would be the next album, etc. And that's how he wanted it to be. He was a real gentleman, says Jardine, a real musical intellect who taught the world how to smile. Who else? Bob Dylan. Heard the sad news about Brian today and thought about all the years I've been listening to him and admiring his genius. Rest in peace, he says. Sir Elton. Sir Elton described him as a true giant who had the biggest influence on his songwriting. He was a musical genius. I think we've had the G word now 4 times, 5 times, and a revolutionary. He changed the goalposts when it came to writing songs and changed music forever. The Who's Roger Daltrey. Oh, by the way, The Who's Roger Daltrey, I think, has just become Sir Roger Daltrey. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to stay sitting down. But well done, Roger. Told the BBC, Brian managed to write songs that took music into the realms of heaven. His harmonies and his melodies always contained so much joy, and he was such a lovely guy. Carole King. Singer-songwriter Carole King said Wilson was my friend and my brother. You will know this anyway, but he was born in 1942, lived in California. The band went on to sell more than 100 million records globally, and they were the biggest American success of the 1960s. There was no other band bigger than them in the 60s. Dozens of hits, including 3 number 1 songs, I Get Around, Help Me Rhonda, and Good Vibrations. Also known for for using the recording studio to create unique sounds. This is really interesting. I read a few places that one of the things that made him so interesting was that he took the recording studio to different places that it had ever been before. He treated the recording studio almost as another instrument, something that could be played with and manipulated, pulled this way and that way to create the sounds and the effects that he wanted. And that's one of the things that made him a musical pioneer, I think we can quite honestly say. Sean Ono Lennon, son of Beatles frontman John Lennon and Yoko Ono, called Wilson the American Mozart and a one-of-a-kind genius from another world. So I think we've had the G word now about 7 times. I think you don't write a tribute to Brian Wilson and not use the word genius. Otherwise, you're just slung out of here. So look, I think we get the picture. Really one of a kind, and working with his brothers and the other people who made up the Beach Boys, who sometimes were incredibly sceptical of what Brian Wilson was doing. They weren't big fans of Pet Sounds, for example. So it's quite interesting that they kind of got to where they got to, because there would have been times when Brian was having trouble with his mental health. I mean, really serious trouble. We're talking about he was actually diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. He took apparently too many psychedelic drugs, which I think there was a view that had damaged his brain. But eventually, a year ago, he was diagnosed with dementia. But I guess what I'm saying is there would have been times in the 60s where he would have been in quite a bad state, and yet at the same time he was trying to kind of get the rest of the Beach Boys to work on the music that he was producing. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. We know that whole albums just got parked, sometimes for not particularly clear reasons. It must have been very difficult to be a Beach Boy. I think you were dealing with this person who was creating the music, who was becoming more and more probably detached and distant. And a difficult situation, certainly. Now, I just want to say a couple of things about Pet Sounds. Okay, the rest of the Beach Boys didn't like Pet Sounds. The album in it featured God Only Knows, Wouldn't It Be Nice, Sloop John B, and it was a massive critical success, particularly in the UK. But the artistic, I'm reading again just from this little article, it says, the artistic change of direction it represented and the angst-ridden nature of some of his tracks mystified some listeners. When the Beatles replied with Revolver in 1966, Brian Wilson embarked on writing what he called his teenage symphony to God. But the resulting album, Smile, would take 37 years to complete, lead to Wilson's complete mental breakdown, and effectively ended his association with the Beach Boys. So, I guess what do we learn from that? Don't go chasing writing the best music that's ever been written ever in the world ever, unless you're really sure you can do it. You're setting yourself up to for a disastrous fail there, I think, certainly for most mere mortals. Okay, I want to just say a couple of other things. Okay, from my point of view, I think when I heard the Beach Boys in my youth, I just want to pick out my favourite tracks. My favourite track, for some reason, was I Can Hear Music. I loved that from their kind of early period, from their period where it was all about harmonies and sunshine and being on the beach and surfing and all those things. I Can Hear Music is absolutely gorgeous. And then I did buy, I've got a 7-inch single somewhere of Good Vibrations. I didn't buy it in the 60s. I would have only been about 3, for goodness sake, stop it. But I did buy it, I think, in the 70s. And then my all out and out, and you won't be surprised to hear this, my out and out favourite Beach Boys song, and I think probably most people kind of agree really, is God Only Knows. I think... and I did buy Pet Sounds. God Only Knows, I still think is majestic, really. It sort of reminds me, in the 60s, there were these moments when bands put out these songs that seemed perfect. I mean, utterly perfect. God Only Knows is one of them. I would say Waterloo Sunset by the Kinks is one. I would say A White Shade of Pale by Procol Harum is one of those. Just can't be bettered. Almost brings the evolution of those groups to a halt because they've just done something so extraordinary. So, yeah, God Only Knows, absolutely up there as one of the greatest songs ever written, ever recorded. So, genius. What do we mean by genius? And who else is in the genius class? Because as I say, if you keep on calling everybody a genius, that's not good for anybody. Okay, so who was a genius? It's very difficult. I don't want to. It's not the kind of title you want to give to somebody who's kind of still living. I would say John Lennon, in his pomp back in the 60s, was a genius, a musical genius. Also knew how to take pop music into places it had never been. David Bowie, I think, musical genius. I'm not sure how many more there are. Kate Bush, maybe, but she's still alive, so don't tell anyone. I think that's it. I don't think there are very many more. Nile Rodgers, he's still alive. Don't tell him. I think that's, honestly, a handful. So genius is something very special. Brian Wilson definitely had it. And thank you for the music. I want to finish with a couple of things. First of all, a little update on Alex Warren, because we've been watching his progress at number one. He is no longer number one. So he did stunningly well. I think we said it was the 7th longest number one in British musical history. So well done, Alex. Better go and get some more tunes out. It was 12 weeks in the end. And then finally, I just want to say we are approaching somewhere, just over the horizon, the release of my 7th album, which is going to be called Might As Well Dance. So over the next couple of weeks, I will be talking more about what goes into an album release, talking a little bit about this particular album, going through the track listing again, playing a couple of the tracks that you won't have heard, and sharing the whole excitement of an album release, because it's quite a big thing, with you, because otherwise what's the point? Have a fantastic weekend. I'll see you soon. Take very good care. Bye-bye.